We all know that items can be very effective in Pathfinder 2e. This is a compilation of builds that can use them quite well. So this build isn't exactly going to be what a lot of you are expecting. While I am going to give you exact feats for levels 1 through 10, this is just one example of how you can build this build towards teamwork. It's designed for this particular party. You can absolutely take different feats or these feats in a different order if you have a different party. I'm not going to tell you that you need to take these exact feats to beat the game. That's not how this works. It's all going to depend on your campaign. And as I said, this is just one example of how you can do it. With that out of the way, let's get to the team strategy for these builds. Our teamwork strategy is actually pretty standard here. But if you're not interested in this, or you've seen my videos on other builds in this party, you can absolutely skip to this timestamp. But the main thing we want to do is debuff our opponents with the off guard condition and anything that can give us a status penalty, as well as buff our allies so they can hit more easily. After that, we mainly want to just blast the heck out of our enemies. And of course, we are going to need healing options. This build will definitely cover our burst damage, as well as our different damage types, and our debuffs. We'll also be using trips and grapples to manipulate our enemy's action economy. We also can focus a little on dex-based skills. For today's ancestry, we did roll Woodland Elf, so we can more easily climb things like trees and other foliage. So if we need to be at ranged combat, we can do it from the trees, allowing us to better hide. We also don't need cover to actually take cover if we're in a forested area, which again helps us with stealth. We did roll Laughing Shadow Magus, but I don't want this to just be a stealthy Magus. No, we want to focus on other things in this build. Of course, the Laughing Shadow Hybrid Study gives us extra speed when we're in Arcane Cascade stance, as well as more damage if our foe is off guard. We need a free hand in order to get that extra damage, as well as a free hand in order to grapple and trip, which is a big part of this build. So we will not be using any weapons here. We will be using our unarmed attacks, which we can definitely still use Spell Strike with, and that covers our burst damage. And of course, tripping and grappling gives opponents the off guard condition, which is a circumstance penalty to AC. This is going to help other builds in this party. And of course, the speed from our Laughing Shadow Hybrid Study is going to help a lot with our mobility, but the Dimensional Assault Conflux spell is definitely going to help with that. We haven't even taken our first feat yet, and we're already a great boss killer because we have a lot of mobility, we can teleport into flanking positions, we can do burst damage to bosses, and we can even debuff them. On a side note, while I do think that using unarmed attacks for this build is effective, you could also use something like a Bastard Sword. You would still be able to do all the things this build can do and have more burst damage. But switching between one-handed and two-handed on your Bastard Sword will mess up your action economy, which is why I think the unarmed version of this build is better. For our attributes, strength is going to be our most important. We're going to be using athletics a lot, and we want good damage. We also need intelligence for those spell strikes. And we will need dexterity because in the beginning, we'll be wearing medium armor so we can be more effective grappler and tripper. But as we level up, we'll want to be increasing our dex so we can be better at stealth and other dex-based skills. And of course, eventually get to the point where we don't need armor and we can get that full mobility bonus from our hybrid study. You can dump just about everything else with this particular Magus. For our first ancestry feat, we're going to be taking Nimble Elf. This is just more mobility, plain and simple. 5 foot more speed means we can move around the battlefield a lot more effectively. And combine that with the fleet general feat, and we have something like 45 movement speed, which is pretty amazing for a grappler, especially in boss fights. Since elves already start with a movement speed of 30, 5 feet from our hybrid study, and then 5 feet from this feat, and 5 feet from fleet. That's 45 feet. And once we're able to get rid of our armor, we can move 50 feet for an action, which is monk level movement speed. And of course, we get our first class feat at level 2. And we'll be taking Arcane Fists. A lot of you might think, oh, we should take the monk archetype here so we have access to monk feats, and we can get our unarmored attacks up to a D6. Well, Arcane Fists is better than that because we don't really need monk feats for this build, and also, an Arcane Fist does the same thing. It increases our fist to a D6, but what makes the Arcane Fist feat better than the monk dedication is that our fists count as magical weapons, which means we can overcome resistances. And that's a big deal, as we do want to do a lot of damage in this build. Plus, we really don't need another skill other than athletics for this build, and acrobatics isn't going to help us at all. At level 4, we'll be taking the Wrestler dedication. This gives us expert in athletics if we don't already have it, and the Titan Wrestler skill feats, which effectively means we can grapple and trip just about anything at this point. And of course, the Wrestler dedication makes it harder for enemies to grapple us or swallow us whole. This one feat flat out makes us better at our debuffs that we want to do, as well as our action economy manipulation. Because remember, if we have them grappled, they either have to attack us or get out of the grapple, and if we have them tripped, they gotta stand up. And either way, that's one action down the drain. And that also makes them off guard, making them easier to hit, both of which are very big deals. For our level 5 ancestry feat, we're going to be taking otherworldly magic. This will give us an extra cantrip from the arcane list. And the arcane list is very good at doing different damage types. So, we will have a lot of cantrips even as a magus. But it doesn't mean we'll be able to cover all the different damage types. So, the more spells we have, especially cantrips, the better. Here, you just want to pick an arcane cantrip that does a different type of damage than the cantrips you already have as a magus. We want as many different damage types as we can get. At level 6, we'll want to take the best feat probably in this build, Combat Grab. So we can make a strike, and if we hit, we can automatically grab the target without even making an athletics check. Granted, this does have the press trait, which means that we have to be suffering a multiple attack penalty to use this. But since we're using fists, we're only going to be taking a -4 on that attack rather than a -5. And other builds in this party may be lowering their AC even more than that, which means we might be only taking an effective -2 to hit rather than a -4. But being able to automatically grab your target is pretty darn amazing. For our level 8 feat, we're going to be taking Spell Swipe. This does take 3 actions, but we can spell strike 2 enemies rather than just 1. So, effectively that means we're doing our burst damage to 2 enemies, which is a pretty big deal. Sometimes it's going to be more beneficial for us to hit 2 enemies with a spell strike rather than debuffing them or manipulating their action economy. Especially in normal encounters where there's going to be more creatures to hit. And they're going to be easier to hit because there's more of them. We don't always need to debuff every foe. For our 9th level ancestry feat, we're going to be taking Otherworldly Acumen. This gives us Revealing Light and Invisibility as extra spells, so we can use once per day each. Invisibility is for the stealth part of this build, which I've already explained why stealth is important for this build. And Revealing Light is for enemies that try to go invisible on us, as we can't really blast our enemies if we can't see them. We're also would have trouble manipulating their action economy. So, being able to say no to invisibility is kind of a big deal here. And the last feat I'm going to cover in this video is Spine Breaker. If we have a foe grappled, we can effectively try to grapple them again, but this time if we succeed, then they're clumsy 1 for a round, and if we critically succeed, they're clumsy 2 for a round, and Clumsy 1 for 1 minute, effectively lowering their AC even more. This is mainly to help us with our single target DPR, as that's not a big part of this build, but it is something we can do, as we won't be able to spell strike if we grapple, use this, and then attack, because spell strike takes 2 actions. But if we can keep a foe grappled, then we might be able to spell strike. But the bottom line here is that we're making it easier for everyone to hit this target, particularly other martials and anyone else that can be in melee combat. But this also helps with spell attack roll spells. Overall, Clumsy is a lot better than Enfeebled, which is why we're taking this over Submission Hold. Now let's talk spells. As I've said before, you want as many different damage types as you can get, but we're mostly going to be using cantrips for our spell strike. That's going to be our burst damage. We also want to use spells that will manipulate the enemy's action economy. For example, things like Mud Pit. Spells like Rhyme Slick and Rouse Skeletons will also be very effective here. Remember that one of our main goals here is to manipulate our enemy's action economy, and we can do that with spells too. Granted, we won't have many spells because we're a magus and not something like a wizard, but we do want to have those available to us, as damage definitely isn't everything. We still need to do our burst damage, but manipulating an enemy's action economy is just as important for this build. As for free archetype, something like Witch or Wizard would give you more spell slots, which would be highly effective. You could also take something like Fighter to get access to Intimidating Strike, which is another status penalty to their AC and other things. And finally, you could take Rogue for this build to get that sneak attack, as well as more skills. But the best free archetype you can take is any class that will give you more spells that are intelligence based, as more spells equals more options. If you guys enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like. And of course, you can check out my Patreon page for a Google Sheet of this build all the way to level 20. And if you want to continue the conversation about teamwork, you can absolutely check out my Discord server, as well as my social media, all of which are in the description below. But if you guys want to see a compilation of a full 4-person party, you can check out this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems. So before we get started with this build, I'd like to remind you guys of a couple things. First, I'd like to remind you of the teamwork strategy for this build, as well as what our Magus is already covering. But if you guys only care about this build, or you've already seen my Magus video, then you're going to want to jump to this timestamp right here. Again, the teamwork strategy for this party is pretty simple. We want to debuff our opponents, buff our allies, protect our allies, and we want to blast the heck out of our enemies. We're also going to need healing options. Our Magus already covers our burst damage, our different damage types, our dex-based skills, our circumstance debuffs, and our action economy manipulation, as well as protecting our more ranged allies. This build will cover our single target DPR, as well as our buffs, and some debuffs. It also covers our intelligence and our wisdom-based recall knowledge. And finally, this build can help protect allies as well. It is a melee build, even though you wouldn't expect it to be a melee build based on the class we're taking. For our ancestry, we did roll Awakened Animal. More specifically, the Flying Awakened Animal. That means, yes, eventually we are going to be able to fly in this build without having to use spell for the Fly spell, which is going to come in very handy. For today's class, we'll be going Wizard, believe it or not. And our arcane thesis is going to be spell substitution. This will give us a lot more versatility. We can change our spells around by spending 10 minutes, which is a pretty big deal here. That is going to be extremely helpful when we know what spells we're going to need ahead of time. And our arcane school is going to be School of Protean Form. We want to focus on buffing and transforming into other creatures in this build. So, School of Protean Form is perfect for that. We do have a few debuff spells in this build, but we're mostly going to want to focus on those buffs and transforming to help protect the other two builds in this party, which will be ranged. Although, as a flying animal, we will be able to fly out of range of melee enemies and rain down more ranged spells as well. But transforming into things like dragons and animals is going to be our main focus here. For skills, as I said, intelligence-based skills are going to be important here, and that's mostly going to be your recall knowledge. But having crafting in this build is going to be effective because the last two builds in this party are going to rely heavily on items. And having someone in the party that is good at making items is going to be effective. Otherwise, yeah, for skills, pick recall knowledge skills like society, arcana, stuff like that. For attributes, since we're focusing on transforming and buffing our allies, our intelligence isn't as important as it would be for other wizard builds. And we won't need strength at all because our damage and our athletics bonus will be coming from our spells that we're using to transform into other creatures. And charisma doesn't factor into this build at all. We will, however, still need a little bit of dexterity, constitution, and wisdom for this build, because we will be using our saving throws when we're in our other forms. So we need those to be at least decently high. Granted, our fortitude save won't be great as a wizard, but we need it to be as high as possible. Okay, so I am going to go over all three of the ancestry feats I'm going to be taking for this build right now because they're mainly just better versions of the same feats. We're going to be taking Take Flight, Strong of Wing, and Full Flight. We have a few spells in our curriculum that are more ranged, so if we take these feats, we can be out of range of our enemies and still cast these spells. And having a fly speed is always great, especially since we don't have to waste a spell on the fly spell for ourselves. We still need to cast fly for our allies if it comes to that, but at least we don't have to cast it on ourselves once we do get that full flight at level 9. Moving on to class feats. We'll be taking Reach Spell. Our buff spells and our debuff spells that are in our curriculum, a lot of them are touch spells. And we don't want to have to be near our targets in order to use them. So Reach Spell gives them a 30-foot range, which is really going to help, especially with those debuff spells that we'll want to use sometimes. But again, we are focusing mostly on transforming and buffing our allies. So we won't use this often, but it will be effective when we do use it. For our level 4 class feat, we're going to be taking Bespell Strikes. When we use a spell to transform, this allows us to do an extra 1d6 force damage. Yeah, transforming may provoke a reaction if we try to do it in front of an enemy, but getting extra damage that first turn that we transform is kind of a big deal. Granted, it's not much more damage, but it will help us with our single target DPR, which is important. At level 6, we are definitely going to need steady spell casting. A lot of times this build is going to require us to cast spells in melee range, which means we are going to take reactions sometimes. And some reactions can disrupt spells, and we don't want that. So this gives us a chance to say, you know what? No, you don't get to disrupt my spell. Granted, it is a DC 15 flat check, which isn't that high of a chance, but at least we have a chance to just automatically transform, even if we do get hit before we can transform into whatever we're going to transform into. For our level 8 feat, we're going to take Advanced School Spell to get the Shifting Form focus spell. Sometimes we're going to want certain aspects of the forms we can transform into without wasting a spell slot actually transforming into the full form. Things like Dark Vision, more speed, climb speed, sense, that sort of thing. So this will allow us to gain those without actually using one of our spell slots. And we'll still be able to talk to our allies and all that. This can be highly effective outside of combat, and even in combat if we want. And the final feat that I'm going to cover in this video is, of course, Quickened Casting. Once per day, just transform for a single action. That's a pretty big deal. We can also use it for other 2-action spells, but our main focus is going to be transformation here, So we're mostly going to want to use this to transform when we really need to, quickly. As that is our main focus in this build, is transforming into other forms. For our spells, we're mostly going to want to focus on buff spells and transformation spells. Unfortunately, buffing is what we're going to have to do with this build, because with the new Arcane list, there isn't near as many form spells as I would like. But we can be in melee if we want to, once we get that elemental form spell from our school. Our school spells do have a few debuff spells, but our intelligence is going to be low or lower than it could be, which means we're not going to want to be focusing on those. Remember, we have reach spell and we have a fly speed, which means eventually we're going to be able to fly out of the reach of melee enemies and buff our allies that way, as well as debuff if we want to. We can also be in melee if we want with those transformation spells, which is going to come in very handy for this party. If you've got free archetype, I do have a few suggestions for what you can take for your free archetype. First is Sentinel. This will give you armor, which will allow you to be in melee more easily, even when you're not in one of your forms. The second one I recommended is Witch, which can give you a lot of transformation spells from other lists. Primal List comes to mind immediately, and the Divine List does have a few spells that allow you to transform into different forms. Of course, Druid is also an option, as that can allow you to use focus points to transform instead of just spell slots. But if you want to be a full monster master, then I highly recommend the Wild Mimic archetype for this build, as you'll be able to use monster abilities that you wouldn't be able to normally use, even when you're not in one of your forms. And that's the build. So, if you guys enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. Let me know how you would do this build. And of course, you can join my social media as well as my Discord server to talk to me and other people about this kind of stuff. And I'm restarting TikTok videos soon, so you guys can catch me on there as well. You can also join my Patreon page if you want a Google Sheet for this build, as well as all my other builds. If you haven't seen my Arcane Grappler Magus build, you can absolutely check it out right here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems. Hello, team players. Sorry I haven't done a long form video in a while, but I've been working on TikTok stuff, and I also wanted to wait until the remastered Guns and Gears came out because we're building a gunslinger today. But before that, I do want to remind you guys of the teamwork strategy for these builds and the roles that the two builds I've covered so far for Arcane Laboratory cover. But if you're only interested in this build, you can jump to this timestamp right here. So the teamwork strategy for this party is actually pretty basic. We want to buff our allies and debuff our enemies. We want to use our more melee-oriented builds to protect our ranged allies. We want to blast the heck out of our enemies. And of course, we are going to need healing options. That last one will be covered by the last build in this party, which I will get to eventually. And of course, the first build in this party was a Magus. So that covers our burst damage, some of our different damage types, as well as our dexterity-based skills, our debuffs, particularly circumstance debuffs, and our action economy manipulation. And of course, our second build was our wizard. That covers our single target DPR, buffs for our allies, some debuffs, our intelligence and wisdom recall knowledge, and it can protect allies if it needs to. With the transformations we get from our school, as well as any other transformations we can pick up from the Arcane list and any other list we have access to. This build covers our single target DPR, as well as our status debuffs, since our wizard won't be debuffing all that much. It'll also cover the damage types that our Magus can't cover, as well as our charisma-based skills. For today's ancestry, we did roll Minotaur. Now that doesn't seem like it would be very good for a gunslinger, particularly the subclass we're going to be taking, but that's why we're taking the 2 free boosts for Minotaur rather than the normal boosts for that ancestry. And for our heritage, we're going to be taking the Talos Versatile Heritage. It's what we rolled after all. We are only going to be taking 1 Talos feat for this build, but it is definitely going to help our defense. The Talos Heritage also gives us resistance equal to half our level to electricity damage, which is another way we can get more defense with this build. We also do get the Detect Metal cantrip, but that's not hugely important for this build. Although that can help us find special metals, which can come in handy. Especially since both us and our wizard are going to be great at crafting items. So this can help us find special metals for our ammunition, which can be very helpful. And of course, we are building a gunslinger, as I said before, and we're going to be taking the Way of the Pistolero as our subclass. For our Slinger's Reload, we get Runketer's Reload, which means we can either create a diversion or demoralize and reload for 1 action, which is definitely going to help with our status debuffs. And of course, our initial deed is 10 paces, allowing us to get a +2 bonus on our initiative and draw a one-handed firearm or crossbow as part of our initiative, all for a free action. We can also step 10 feet as a free action on the first action of our turn. So if an enemy is close to us, we can just step back 10 feet and fire without provoking a reaction. And of course, with Pistolero's Retort, we can use a reaction to strike any creature that critically fails an attack roll against us. So anytime they roll that nat 1, we just get to hit them, which is pretty great. And of course, if you can get this build up to level 15, you get the Greater Deed, Grim Swagger, allowing you to frighten foes, using either deception or intimidation. But of course, as usual, I'm only going up to level 10 with this build in this video, so you might not even get that far. For skills for this build, you are definitely going to either need deception or intimidation, preferably both. You're also going to need crafting for this build, as we'll talk about that when we get to feats. But yes, deception and or intimidation are going to need to be our highest skills. For our attributes, dexterity is going to be the most important. Not only so we can hit better, but also because some of our abilities are going to go off our class DC, and our dexterity is what determines that. We are also, of course, going to need charisma, as a lot of this build does focus on charisma-based skills. You may also need a little bit of strength, depending on what firearm you're actually using. But we do want one-handed firearms for this build, because depending on the situation, we're either going to be dual-wielding one-handed firearms, or if we want to do different types of damage, we're going to need a free hand. It all depends on what we're facing and whether it has a weakness or not. Or, of course, if it has a resistance. For level 1, our first ancestry feat is going to be Reflective Defense. If we're in bright or dim light and a creature targets us, we can shine that light in their eyes, making them dazzled until the end of our next turn. While this isn't a status debuff, it is a debuff, and can definitely help everyone in the party, as everything is concealed to them at that point. And putting a flat check on their attack rolls is pretty nice. And our first class feat is going to be Dual Weapon Reload. Remember, we want to either be dual wielding or we want a firearm and a free hand. So, when we are dual wielding, we want to be able to reload our weapon without having to have a hand free. Our level 2 feat is going to be Fake Out. This allows us to aid our allies without having to spend an action preparing to help. Only really works on strikes, but this can help our Magus extremely, especially since we're going to be legendary in our attack rolls, with firearms anyway. We are mostly going to want to focus on debuffs in this build, but we do have some buffs. that are available to us. Level 4 is when our different damage types come into play, because we're going to be taking alchemical shots, which basically allows us to take alchemical bombs and put them into our gun so we can do different types of damage. And we are pretty much going to be able to cover every damage type that the Magus isn't covering, making this build fantastic for overcoming resistances and hitting weaknesses. For our level 5 Ancestry feat, we're going to be taking Pantheon Magic, which gives us a Divine Cantrip. There are a number of good Divine Cantrips we can take for this build. For example, we can take Forbidding Ward or Shield for our defense. We can take the Light Spell, so that our reflective defense is always live, and we can even take an attack spell like Needle Darts. But the one I recommend for this build is Divine Lance, as that'll give us the ability to do spirit damage, which will hit just about everything in the game, and we might not always have access to. And taking an attack cantrip will mean even if we run out of ammunition or alchemical bombs, we can still do damage, which is definitely something worth having in your back pocket. And of course, we're also going to need Munitions Crafter and Munitions Machinist in order to make our own bombs, so we don't have to rely on the wizard as much. Granted, the wizard is going to be able to make more bombs more often for us because they're going to have high intelligence from the beginning, but we don't want to rely too heavily on the wizard either. And we will want to be increasing our intelligence as we level up. And it's going to be good to be able to make our own ammunition and alchemical bombs for this build. For our level 9 Ancestry feat, we're going with Friendly Fling. Effectively, this allows us to throw our allies up to 20 feet. They do take damage from this, from our horns, but this means that if our melee fighters are within 20 feet of an enemy, they don't have to spend an action moving up. And we can also use this to get the last build in this party away from enemies. This is a trade-off, but it can be extremely helpful in some situations. And the last feat I'm going to cover in this video is called Shots. We basically target a specific part of the creature and inflict a debuff depending on what we targeted. And of course, we also get to make a strike, which means we're doing damage as well. If we target the arms, we can make them enfeebled. If we target the head, we can make them stupefied. If we target their legs, we reduce their speed by 10 feet. And if the creature has wings and we target them, then we can make them fall. But they don't take any fall damage, sadly. All of these are status penalties except for the wings thing, but that's only on creatures that can fly. Combining this with the Magus' circumstance penalties from things like tripping and stuff can really help out. Granted, I wish one of these made the target clumsy, because that would be amazing, but these can help, particularly if you're going against strength-based enemies or spellcasters. Slowing them down can also be very effective. For free archetype, the first archetype I recommend for this build is the Beast Gunner. That'll give you the Arcane or Primal list that's allowing you to do extra damage types without having to rely so heavily on your bombs. The second archetype I recommend for this build is Martial. You're going to have high charisma, and Dread Martial Stance is one of the best feats in the game. It is an excellent way to frighten foes until you get that Grim Swagger at level 15. And as a gunslinger, you are trained in martial weapons. Not an expert, but you are trained. So Martial is absolutely on the table. And finally, the Sniping Duo archetype fits extremely well with this build as well, particularly if you are wanting to focus on teamwork, which if you're subscribed to this channel, I would think you would want to be. The best class to pick for your spotter is the Magus with this party, but any character that can be in melee combat is going to help this build immensely with this archetype. And that's the build. If you guys enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel, all that other YouTube stuff. And remember, I'm on TikTok as well, so Be sure to check that out. You can also get a Google Sheet for this build, as well as all my other builds on my Patreon page. Link is in the description. If you guys haven't seen the other 2 builds in this party, you can absolutely check them out right here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems. Okay guys, it's time for the 4th build in my Arcane Laboratory party. And of course, I am still going to go over the teamwork strategy for these builds, as well as the roles for the 3 builds that I've already covered. But again, if you're only interested in this build, you can jump to this timestamp right here. So with this party, we want to buff our allies and debuff our enemies. We want to protect ranged allies, which this build will be a ranged build. We want to blast the heck out of our enemies, which this build will do very well. And we want healing options, which again, this build will cover very nicely. So, our Magus covers our burst damage, some of our different damage types, our circumstance debuffs, some of our dexterity-based skills, and of course, action economy manipulation. Our Magus also allows us to protect our more ranged allies like this build. Then we've got our Wizard, which covers our single target DPR, our status buffs, some of our status debuffs, our recall knowledge, and our ally protection. Third, we have our Gunslinger, which covers our single target DPR again, as well as our damage types, our charisma-based skills, and our status debuffs. This build can cast any spell in the game, as long as you have the right items, so it can cover anything a spellcaster can cover. That includes our burst healing, our multi-target damage, our different damage types, and this build can even target different defenses. This build also covers our in-between combat healing, our recall knowledge, and our wisdom and charisma-based skills. For today's heritage, we did roll Venom Tail Kobold. This will allow us to do poison damage to an enemy when we don't have the right spell for a situation. And when we run out of spells, which we might actually, we can still do good damage. Today's class is going to be the Thaumaturge, which of course means we get 3 implements. Starting with the Chalice, which of course covers our in-between combat healing. So we can give our allies temporary hit points during combat, or we can heal them for 3 hit points per level outside of combat. This combined with the medicine skill means our out-of-combat healing is definitely covered by this build. This also eventually means that we can get rid of status debuffs on our party members, which is going to help a lot. Our second implement is going to be our Bell, which can cover our status debuffs in addition to our spells. So we can always debuff our enemies, even if we don't have the right spells available. Our third implement is going to be a Tome, which gives us extra skills. Thus, we can take skills that aren't always useful, like survival and thievery, and we can change them every single day. For skills, your most important is going to be your crafting, as this build will use a lot of scrolls. Second, you're going to need medicine, because that's going to help with your out-of-combat healing in addition to your chalice. And of course, you're going to need recall knowledge skills. This build can also be really good at charisma-based skills, obviously. For your attributes, strength and constitution aren't going to be important for this build. However, you'll need just about everything else. Charisma, obviously, because you're a thaumaturge. Dexterity for your attacks and your defense, as well as intelligence and wisdom for recall knowledge. But intelligence and wisdom don't need to be as high because we have other party members that can cover recall knowledge, like our wizard. Charisma and dexterity need to be your highest, and wisdom as your third, because that helps with your will saves too. For this spell's ancestry feats, we're going to want to take feats that allow us to move around more easily so we can avoid our enemies. So our first level feat is going to be Scamper. So we can stride 5 additional feet if we are adjacent to an enemy, and we get a +2 bonus to our AC against any reactions that enemy has that are triggered by that movement. We can cast any spell in the game with this build, which means smart enemies are going to want to be in melee with us. And that means we need to easily be able to get out of that situation, as we don't want to be in melee with anybody in this build. Our first level class feat is what allows us to cast any spell in the game. With Scroll Thaumaturgy, we can activate any scroll that we find using our Thaumaturge class DC rather than spell DC. While we can't make scrolls yet, we'll definitely want to be on the lookout for them, as that's what this entire build is about. Root to Life allows us to stabilize dying creatures for 1 action, and we can also remove persistent damage if we spend 2 actions. This can really help our allies stay up, which is why we're taking it at level 2. At level 4, we'll be taking Instructive Strike. We are supposed to be doing at least some recall knowledge in this build, so this allows us to do a recall knowledge after we hit a target with a strike, which can be a ranged attack. And if we happen to get a lucky critical hit, we get a +2 bonus on the check. Again, we can cast any spell in the game as long as we have a scroll, which means we're going to want to know what our enemy's lowest save is, as that will tell us what spell to use, what scroll, if we have it. And we can do this even if we have Exploit Vulnerability up. So once we pick up this feat, using this and then using the right scroll will definitely help. Of course, we'll want to have Exploit Vulnerability up as well, which doesn't exactly help our action economy, but it is still a good option. So our first round, once we get this feat, should be something like this. Exploit Vulnerability, then use this feat with a strike, and then probably do something like Intimidation or Move. After that, we can start using our scrolls to cast spells, especially if we succeed on that recall knowledge. For our level 5 Ancestry feat, we're going to take Winglets. This allows us to leave 5 additional feet, and we can jump 10 feet farther than what we would normally be able to do with an athletics check, so long as we don't go over our speed. Not only is this another great way of getting away from enemies, but we're also going to need this to take Winglet Flight if we get high enough level, which of course is another great way of getting away from enemies. At level 6, we'll be taking Scroll Esoterica. This allows us to create temporary scrolls. At this level, we can make 1 temporary first level spell scroll. At 8th, we'll be able to create a scroll for a 2nd level spell. These can be any scroll of any tradition, making us a lot more versatile than any druid. And druids are already pretty versatile. At level 8, we'll be taking Know-It-All. This allows us to get more information whenever we succeed at recall knowledge. Thus, we can find out what our enemy's lowest save is, but we can also find out about his special abilities or anything else we want to know. So this can definitely help when we want to know more information, or the wizard simply fails at his recall knowledge. We are supposed to use recall knowledge at least some in this build, and this will definitely help with that. For our level 9 Ancestry feat, we're going to be taking Fleeing Shriek. This allows us to do a good amount of sonic damage to every creature within 10 feet of us. We can then stride, and our movement doesn't trigger reactions from any creature that fails or critically fails on the save against this damage. So now we can do damage, and we can also get away from enemies. We can only use this once per hour, but it is very effective. We do have to be careful about this though, because we can't hit our allies with this. But this is the feat we definitely want to pick up at level 9. And the last feat for this video is going to be Share Weakness. Effectively, this allows us to give our allies the benefits of our Exploit Vulnerability, assuming the creature has a mortal weakness. Thus, on that first round, we can do even more damage to the enemy. We won't be using this feat much beyond that first round, but it's very helpful for that first round. For free archetype, I recommend the Scroll Trickster or the Scroll Master archetype, giving you more scrolls, in addition to the Medic archetype, as this build is supposed to be a healer, and the Medic archetype will definitely help with that. And that's the build. This build can pretty much work with any party. It doesn't matter what the other players are playing, because this build can cast any spell in the game. It's a very effective build. But if you're using it with this party, I would highly recommend you focus on healing, as we don't really have that with this party at the moment. And of course, if you want a Google Sheet for this build and a bunch of other builds, you can check out my Patreon page. If you're new to Pathfinder 2e, I would recommend checking out my TikTok, as that's where I cover that kind of stuff. But if you guys enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more Pathfinder 2e teamwork content. I'm having some business issues with getting paid on YouTube, so my next video will be on this channel as well as my new channel, Team Player Gaming Plus. So it would be fantastic if you guys would go and subscribe over there, especially if you really enjoy my content. But if you guys want to see the rest of the builds in this party, I recommend you check out these videos here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.